Send her back, or stand between her and the men who think a woman's signature means nothing unless a man co-signs it. That's the choice Broderick Hale faced on a Tuesday morning in late October, with frost still on the fence posts and a stranger's daughter sitting at his kitchen table like she'd always belonged there. He hadn't asked for any of it. Broderick Hale was 51 years old, a cattle rancher outside Pincher Creek, Alberta, with calloused hands and a reputation for being fair but not soft. He ran 400 head of Hereford on land his grandfather had broken a century before. He did not believe in complications. He believed in weather, feed prices, and the particular silence that settles over a ranch at 4 in the morning when everything is as it should be. His wife, Dorothea, had passed 6 years prior. Since then, Broderick had managed. He cooked badly, kept the house adequately, and told himself he didn't mind eating supper alone. His neighbor Gwen had suggested, more than once, that he consider putting a notice in one of those papers. A rancher in good standing, with land paid off and no outstanding debts, was not a bad prospect. He'd ignored her for 2 years. Then he hadn't. The woman who answered the notice was not what he expected. He'd written plainly. He was not a romantic. He wanted a capable woman, someone who understood what ranch life actually meant. Early mornings, hard seasons, the kind of quiet that could press on a person like weather. He wanted someone settled, practical, old enough to know her own mind. He'd thought he was being clear. Ivy Stratton was 26 years old. A schoolteacher from Lethbridge, with dark red hair she kept pinned back, and gray eyes that had a way of going very still when she was thinking. She was not what the word plain conjured. She was not soft, either. She'd written back to his notice in a hand that was steady and without flourish. And her letter said, "I am not looking to be taken care of. I am looking to be useful and to build something that lasts. If that is what you are also looking for, I am willing to meet." Bob Broderick had read that letter 3 times. They met in November at a diner in Fort Macleod. He'd arrived 10 minutes early and ordered coffee and sat with his hat on the table and felt, for the first time in years, uncertain. She walked in and found him without hesitation, as though she'd already decided. They talked for 2 hours. She asked about the land, the herd, the water access, the winter road conditions. She asked whether the house had good insulation and whether he'd had the roof replaced within the last decade. She did not ask whether he was lonely. He was grateful for that. He asked her why she'd answered a notice from a man twice her age. Ivy had set down her coffee cup and looked at him in that level, still way she had. "My father," she said, "has been trying to arrange something with a man named Gareth Colton for the past year." I said no. He stopped listening. I needed to make a decision before a decision was made for me. Broderick didn't ask more. He figured she'd tell him what he needed to know, when he needed to know it. They were married in December at the town office, with 2 witnesses from the municipality and no ceremony beyond what the law required. Broderick had offered more, had said she could invite whoever she wanted. Ivy had said this was sufficient. He'd taken her at her word. The first weeks were careful. They moved around each other in the house like 2 people learning the layout of a new space, polite and attentive and not yet easy. She was a hard worker. He'd half expected that to be the thing she'd exaggerated, because people often did, but Ivy had not exaggerated anything. She learned his routines without being asked and adapted her own without complaint. She had a way with the dogs. She repaired a fence section he'd been meaning to get to for 3 months, and when he came back from the south pasture and found it done, she was already making supper and didn't mention it. He started looking forward to coming back to the house. He noticed things about her slowly, the way you notice a change in a familiar landscape. She woke before him most mornings. She read at night, sitting near the lamp with her legs curled under her, and she had opinions about what she read. Strong ones, that she offered carefully at first, and then less carefully as the weeks passed. She made him laugh twice in the first month, which surprised him. She did not talk about her family. January was brutal. A cold snap hit that dropped temperatures to -35 for 11 days straight, and they lost 2 calves and nearly lost a third. Ivy was out in it with him, without being asked, carrying feed, breaking ice on the water troughs at 2 in the morning while the wind cut across the open ground like something with intentions. She didn't complain. She also didn't pretend it wasn't terrible. There was something Broderick respected enormously about a person who could acknowledge that something was hard, without falling apart over it. He came in from a late check one night to find her at the kitchen table, with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and he sat down across from her without taking his coat off, and they didn't speak for a while, and it wasn't uncomfortable. "The 3rd calf's going to make it," he said finally. Ivy nodded. "I know, I checked on her an hour ago." He looked at her. "You should have been asleep." So should you. He almost smiled. She saw it and almost smiled back. Something settled between them that night that hadn't been there before. Not romantic, not yet. Something quieter, and maybe more durable than that. A recognition. The sense that the other person was, genuinely, someone worth knowing. It was mid-February when her father came. Broderick was in the yard when the truck pulled in. A newer model, Alberta plates, and a man behind the wheel who sat for a moment before getting out as if he was calculating something. Desmond Stratton was in his mid-60s, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of confident physical presence that came from a lifetime of being the largest person in most rooms. He had Ivy's gray eyes, but none of her stillness. His moved constantly, assessing. "You hail?" he said. "I am," Broderick said. Desmond looked at the house, the outbuildings, the equipment. Smaller operation than I expected. "You're welcome to leave then." Desmond looked at him then, directly, recalibrating. "I want to see my daughter." Broderick said he'd let her know she had a visitor, and went inside. Ivy was at the kitchen counter, and she went still when he said her father's name, that particular stillness that had nothing to do with thinking, and everything to do with stealing. "You don't have to come out," Broderick said. "Yes, I do," she said. "If I don't, he'll take it as weakness." She went out. Broderick stayed near the door. He couldn't hear everything, but he heard enough. Desmond said that the marriage wasn't recognized by the family. He said that Ivy had made a foolish decision under pressure, and that there were ways to address it. He said that Gareth Colton was still willing, which he seemed to think was a significant concession. Ivy listened to all of it with her arms at her sides and her face, in that level, still arrangement, and when her father finished, she said, "I'm not interested." Desmond's voice shifted. "You don't have a choice in this, Ivy. You're my daughter." "I'm also a married woman," she said, "and an adult, and I'm standing on my husband's land, and I'd like you to leave." He didn't leave. He came back 3 days later with a man Broderick didn't recognize. Younger, clean-cut, with the manner of someone accustomed to offices and paperwork. He introduced himself as a solicitor. He had a document that he described as a petition for annulment, on the grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. Broderick read the document twice, slowly on the porch, while the solicitor waited. "She signed the marriage certificate herself," Broderick said. "The petition contends she was not in a position to exercise sound judgment," the solicitor said. "She was the one who answered the notice," Broderick said. "She was the one who came to Fort Macleod. She was the one who set the terms." "Mr. Hale, the petition," Broderick said, "can go ahead and be filed, and I'll be speaking to my own solicitor this afternoon." He went inside and told Ivy. She sat at the kitchen table, very straight, and listened with her hands flat on the table surface, and when he finished she said, "I'm sorry, I should have told you this was possible." "You don't need to be sorry," Broderick said. "You need to tell me what you want." She looked at him. "Tell me what you want," he said again. "Not what you're willing to settle for, what you actually want." Ivy was quiet for a moment. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to build what we're building. And I want my father to understand that he doesn't get to decide things for me anymore." "And that's what we're doing," Broderick said. His solicitor was a woman named June Ochterberg, out of Lethbridge, who had been practicing family law for 30 years, and who listened to the situation without interrupting, and then said, with great calm, that the petition was without merit, and she was happy to say so in as many courtrooms as necessary. The weeks before the hearing were strange. The ranch kept running because it had to. Cows didn't pause for legal proceedings, and Ivy and Broderick kept working it together, and the ease between them that had been building since January kept building, quietly and without announcement. She told him more about her father, about growing up in a household where her opinions were treated as preliminary drafts awaiting revision by someone else. She told him about Gareth Colton, a man 20 years, her senior with money enough to make Desmond feel the arrangement was an achievement, and the way her father had stopped presenting it as a possibility and started presenting it as a conclusion. "Did you ever consider just going along with it?" Broderick asked. "No," Ivy said without hesitation, "not once." He believed her. She asked him, once, whether he'd had doubts, about the marriage, about getting involved in her family's situation. Broderick thought about it, honestly. "I had doubts before you got here," he said, "about whether the whole idea was foolish, whether I was too old for it." He paused. "Once you got here, I stopped having doubts." Ivy looked at him for a moment and then looked away, and he thought he'd said too much, but when she looked back there was something different in her face. Not soft, exactly, but open. The hearing was held in Lethbridge in late March, a gray day with melt ice on the sidewalks, and the particular smell of Alberta spring, which is more about mud than flowers. Desmond was there with his solicitor. Ivy sat beside June Ochterberg at the respondents' table, and Broderick sat in the gallery where the solicitor had suggested he sit and watched. It went as June had said it would, mostly. The petition's argument rested on the claim that Ivy had been in a state of emotional distress that impaired her judgment when she answered the notice and entered the marriage. June presented a clear, methodical account of the timeline. Ivy had found the notice herself. She'd written the first letter herself. She'd initiated the meeting in Fort Macleod. She had taught school for 4 years, managed her own apartment in Lethbridge, maintained her own financial accounts, and conducted herself as a fully autonomous adult in every documented interaction. Then, Ivy took the stand. Broderick watched her walk to the witness stand, with that level, unhurried way she had, and he felt something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite worry, but had elements of both. June asked her to describe in her own words the circumstances that led to her answering the notice. Ivy folded her hands on the railing and spoke clearly. She described her father's arrangement with Gareth Colton. She described telling her father no on 5 separate occasions over 14 months, and the ways her refusals had been managed, minimized, reframed as something other than what they were. She described arriving at a family dinner in November to find Gareth Colton seated at the table with a document that her father described as a formality, and understanding in that moment that her no had never been heard as a no. She described sitting with her laptop that same night and looking for another option. Was the decision impulsive? June asked. No, Ivy said. I'd been thinking about it for months. I just didn't have a specific direction until that night. Were you frightened? Ivy considered this. I was determined, she said finally. Those aren't always different things. The petition was dismissed. Desmond's solicitor attempted an appeal on procedural grounds that June had anticipated, and that too went nowhere. It was over by mid-afternoon. They drove back to Pincher Creek mostly in silence, which by then was the kind of silence that didn't need filling. The fields on either side of the highway were showing the first thin green of April under the gray sky, tentative but definite, the way things come back after a long season. Broderick pulled into the yard and turned off the engine, and they sat for a moment. It's done, he said. It's done, she agreed. He looked at the house, the light on in the kitchen because she'd left it on when they left, which she always did, and thought about how it was the first time in 6 years that he'd come home to a house with a light already on. Ivy, he said. She looked at him. I'm glad you answered that notice. She was quiet for a moment, and he didn't rush her, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something in it he hadn't heard before. I'm glad you wrote it, she said. They went inside. The dogs came to meet them at the door. The kitchen was warm. Supper needed making, and the morning would come early as it always did, and there were 3 weeks left before at Slilving season, and more than enough to occupy 2 people who'd both chosen, clearly and without reservation, to be exactly where they were. Broderick put the kettle on. Ivy hung up her coat and reached past him to get the mugs down from the shelf, and their hands were briefly close in the way of people who have learned the geography of a shared space, and neither of them stepped back, and the light stayed on all evening, steady and without apology, against the long darkness of the Alberta night. What stays with me thinking about Ivy and Broderick is how much courage it takes to act before anyone gives you permission. Ivy didn't wait for the situation to improve on its own. She didn't wait for her father to come around, didn't wait for someone to rescue her, didn't wait for a better option to appear. She sat down that night after the dinner, with the documents still on the table, and Gareth Colton's smug certainty still in the room, and she made a decision. That's not impulsiveness. That's someone who has thought clearly enough, for long enough, to recognize the moment when thinking has to become doing. I've come to believe that's one of the rarest things there is. The ability to see your own situation honestly, without flinching, and then act on what you see instead of on what you wish were true. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the romance of it, though there's plenty of that. It's the clarity. Ivy knew what she was saying no to. She also knew, with real precision, what she was saying yes to. Not a particular man, not a guaranteed outcome, but a life shaped by her own judgment. That takes a kind of integrity that doesn't come from following rules or meeting expectations. It comes from knowing yourself well enough to trust your own read on a situation, even when everyone around you is telling you that you're wrong. Broderick had his own version of that. He could have stayed out of it when Desmond came. He could have handed Ivy back the problem and said this was between her and her family. Nobody would have blamed him much. Instead, he called June Ochterberg and sat in that courthouse gallery and didn't look away. Not because he was owed anything, not because it made him look good, just because it was the right thing to do and he was capable of doing it. There's something I find genuinely moving about that. Doing right by someone when you don't have to is a different kind of strength than doing right by someone when the world is watching. And then there's Ivy on the witness stand, hands folded, speaking clearly about 14 months of being ignored and managed and redirected. She didn't perform distress. She didn't soften it to make the room more comfortable. She just told the truth, in order, and let it sit there. That's not easy. I've watched people crumble under far less pressure than that, not because they lacked the facts, but because they lacked the steadiness to deliver them without flinching. Ivy had that steadiness. She'd built it over years of having her voice treated as something optional, and she'd decided, somewhere along the way, that she wasn't going to become smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. What Ivy and Broderick made together wasn't built on grand gestures. It was built on showing up. At 2 in the morning in -35, at a courthouse in Lethbridge, at a kitchen table with the kettle on. The light stayed on. That's what I think about when I think about what it means to build something that lasts. You can't do it without knowing what's right, without thinking clearly enough to act on it, and without the endurance to keep going when the cold sets in and the outcome isn't certain yet. The light stayed on. That was enough to come home to.